Everyone is here. Hello and welcome. Where are we going here? Yes, we've got people. Hello, everybody. All right, we've got text sorted. We've got people jumping in and getting into the waiting room. So we're going to just jump straight into it. Hello and welcome to our biggest snapshot update ever. We've got a really packed agenda. We've got a lot of interesting updates, little case studies or two, room for questions, and most importantly, the Minister launching these new snapshot updates. We're going to just jump straight into it. We've had feedback in the past that we want to start right on time. That's what we're going to do. 11 o'clock on the dot. I'd like to start by acknowledging First Nation people throughout the land. We're speaking from the traditional lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that we are living and working on unceded land. Thanks for joining us. My name's Alexi Lynch. I'm the Business Manager at Ironbark Sustainability. We've got a lot of people on hand here to talk and give updates and answer questions. Imogen Jubb, Innovations Unit Project Officer and the Snapshot Project Manager Extraordinaire. We've got Paul Brown, Ironbark's Managing Director, Matt Sullivan, Head of Data Analytics at Tasmania, Rachel Armstead might be online, Dr. Richard Ryle. We're all going to try and answer all the questions as we go along and keep the discussion going. We've also got Jenny Fryden, Ironbark's Climate Project Officer, and Charlotte Summers, the Ops Admin Officer, helping behind the scenes. And I know we've got Stephen Pollard and Paris Nichols from DELP as well online, who have been leading the team from DELP. At last count, we had 230 registrations. So a lot of familiar faces and names online. It's awesome to see. We've also got some names from council areas that have been pretty devastated by the recent floods through the east coast of Australia. And we just want to give a bit of a special shout out to you guys. We'll all be on the front line of climate impacts, and the extreme weather impacts that have battered Australia and the globe are getting worse. This is the time that you're bearing the brunt. For some communities, we know this is the second or third major disaster in the last few years, and local governments are on the front line. And so needless to say, we're all thinking of you, and we hope that the waters are receding and you're going okay. This is what we are going to go through today. A little bit of housekeeping, a little bit about us and about you. Thank you for filling in the survey in advance. We've got the Victorian Government Ministerial Address, and then we're going to go through all of the updates of Snapshot and talk a little bit about Snapshot in action. So I'm just going to jump into the housekeeping. This is now hopefully pretty straightforward for most people. You're automatically muted when you're on. If not, please do mute yourself, because we will start picking that up, and we've got a lot of people here. We are recording, and that's going to be nice and casual and informal. We do have a lot to go, so we will stick to the agenda, but we still will keep it pretty informal. Also encourage you to jump on and change your Zoom handle with your name, your organisation, and the land that you're calling from. That's the two little dots, or you can ask in the chat. We get a lot of questions. We got 40 or 50 in advance of today. We get daily questions to the hello@snapshot email address, and I'm sure we'll get more along today. And there's no way we're going to get through them all. We'll try and follow up where we can, and we did try and group the main themes, and that's the ones we'll start at later. But don't worry if we don't get to your questions, especially if they're related to data. We do have a special Data Nerd webinar coming up. Sign up for that. It's in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll have an hour. There won't be really presentations. It's just a chance to just ask everything you ever wanted. And finally, if you can, it'd be nice to see people's faces. You know what it's like when you see this in a Zoom meeting. So please try and share your video or your screen. So Ironbark have got about 50 odd staff that work with councils around Australia to help tackle climate change. We also have developed Snapshot with Beyond Zero Emissions, an independent solutions-based think tank, one of the most progressive and leading and amazing think tank organisations out there. We pulled our resources and our data and our IP together a couple of years ago with some very generous funding from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and created Snapshot, that we all know quite well now. The tool that provides nationally consistent emissions data in accordance with the best practice principles, the GPC protocol, the best data source that improves with every iteration, and more importantly, is available to everyone, all 537 councils around Australia. The evolution of Snapshot is quite interesting and something that we're really proud of, because one of the key things that underpins it is that the data needs to be available for everyone. We originally were working with councils, a lot of who are here today, 4 or 5 years ago, developing one-off emissions profiles, community emissions inventories, whatever you want to call them, at a couple of grand each. Meanwhile, we were talking to BZE, including Imogen Jubb, who was there at the time, working with community groups who are often spending time trying to learn how to develop inventories and learn about the data, go through the 200-page emissions protocol document. And we just sort of figured that that's not working for everybody or anybody, and none of us are doing our job if we've got community groups who are still trying to learn data when the data's there. And so the ethos that underpins Snapshot is that the data should be available for all. And every time we get improvements, we don't just improve for 1 or 2 councils or 1 or 2 community groups, we lift for all 537 councils. We want to keep doing that. There are a few questions that will come up around the future of Snapshot, but that's something that underpins everything. We've also had some pretty amazing organisations and partners throughout this time, and independent technical review from some big local and global organisations. And recently, Snapshot sponsors, we love you for very different reasons, and people have come on for different reasons, but the ability to say that, you know, we're actually providing this information and supporting this for community, because we've got a lot of community groups that use Snapshot as well. The City of Darwin, as a gold sponsor, are sponsoring, I guess, the whole of the Northern Territory and 17 councils who might not be able to do it otherwise. And finally, this is you. We've got, as I said, 230 odd registrations, which is pretty big. A fair chunk from Victoria, but a nice smattering from around Australia. We had a few questions that we asked in advance, and we want to provide this information back to everybody so you know who is in the virtual room and where everybody's at. This is one of the questions that you might recall answering, and it's just interesting to note that still most councils do not report community greenhouse emissions, although we've got an increasing number that do, and a lot that would do it if they could do it via Snapshot. So that's good to keep in mind. And the other one that we want to share with you now was, we asked, what updates and improvement do you want from Snapshot going forward? And this is what you said. And I'll just leave that for 10 or 15 seconds, because I think what's quite interesting is those top 3 updates or improvements are all really related to data, and they're things that we've been trying to look at and are really key to the update that we've got now, and potentially the updates in the future as well. The large emitters in the industrial and the commercial sector is one thing that keeps coming up. So we use this to look at how we're moving forward, where the updates are, and also, given Snapshot is supposed to be a public good, it helps keep everyone accountable that we're doing things that are what everybody wants to do. In the past, we've spent a little bit more time going over the responses from councils, so we do share that information, but we're really pushed for time today. One of the limitations, obviously, online is that you can't go and talk to each other and ask, you know, what your questions were, or what are the themes or the concerns that you have. And we ask that in advance through the registration survey, and we have that info. We don't have time to go through it now, but we will give it to you all afterwards. And so after this webinar, jump onto the feedback form to get the slide deck, and we'll also give you the information if you're interested, so you can look at what other people are thinking about, the one thing they want to focus on, or the questions that they have, and try and see some of those themes and make sure that we've got those themes right. Okay, there are some pretty big features that we've got here for 2022. And I would like to thank the Victorian Government, who have provided funding and support to update Snapshot with new features to improve data accuracy, look at some time series, which again is something that was asked for, and provide some more detailed subsector data for the first time. This is a bit of a data game changer, we think, from a decision-making and engagement point of view, and we really appreciate the approach of the Victorian state government as well, aligning, I think, with our ethos that the improvements that are made aren't just for the councils in Victoria or the councils that can afford to do this, but again, across all 530 snapshots across Australia. We're really lucky that we get to hear from the Victorian Minister for Environment and Climate Change, the Honourable Lily D'Ambrosio, who's going to introduce these changes, officially launch this new snapshot and provide some context and background. Only late last week, the Victorian government introduced increasing targets for clean energy and emissions reduction, setting the state on course to reach 95% share of renewables by 2035 and 70 to 80% reduction in emissions by the same time. And so it is an exciting time to look at what all the states are doing, and a great time to hear the latest from the Minister herself, who recorded this message yesterday.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the updated Snapshot climate tool. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands where we are all meeting on today. And in my case, that is the land of the Wurundjeri people. And I would like to also extend my respects to their elders, past and present, and any Aboriginal elders who may be joining us today. As we all know, the effects of climate change are being felt right around the world, with record heat waves and natural disasters. Here in Victoria, we're seeing higher temperatures, an increase in the intensity of extreme rainfall events that can lead to flooding, rising sea levels, harsher fire weather and longer bushfire seasons, as well as more unstable weather patterns. We must act now, and Victoria is acting. I'm so proud of Victoria's role as a leader on climate action. Victoria was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to legislate a net zero emissions target. And we've announced massive interim reduction targets, which see us lead the world as we chart our pathway to net zero emissions. The Victorian Government recognises that acting on climate change is fundamental for a thriving and resilient future for Victoria, and it is critical for us to work together to achieve this. We are committed to empowering communities, businesses and all levels of government to accelerate action on climate change and deliver on our ambitious targets. And voluntary council pledges under Victoria's Climate Change Act of 2017 provide an important avenue to recognise the substantial efforts of Victorian local councils to reduce emissions and to engage in meaningful dialogue and collaboration on climate action. That's why I am so pleased today to launch the upgraded Snapshot Climate Tool. Developed locally, the Snapshot Climate Tool is an innovative source of spatial information about greenhouse gas emissions. It is used by a wide range of groups to inform climate action, including local councils and local communities. This year, the Victorian Government provided a $100,000 grant to the Snapshot team at Ironbark Sustainability to improve the detail, accuracy and usefulness of spatial emissions profiles that are available. The updates provide more granular data, better time series information and improved methodologies to calculate and verify emissions profiles. This information will support climate action by Victorian councils and communities and their local households, businesses and industries. The Victorian Government has received 22 voluntary council pledges to date, many of which draw on snapshot data to inform their plans for ambitious climate action. These updates to snapshot emissions profiles make it easier than ever for Victorian councils to identify emissions and develop climate actions. I encourage all Victorian councils to consider submitting a council pledge to help bring these ambitions and actions together under the legislative framework of Victoria's Climate Change Act of 2017. Since we legislated a net zero emissions target with the Climate Change Act, we've made real progress. The recently released Victorian Greenhouse Gas Emissions Report 2020 illustrates our success in reducing Victoria's emissions, with emissions falling to 30% below 2005 levels in 2020. This exceeded the 2020 emissions reduction target of 15 to 20% below 2005 levels. We've achieved these results by taking concrete action. The Victorian Government has committed more than $2 billion to accelerate climate action and invest in our state's clean energy future. We've also set strong targets to bring online more renewable energy, and Victoria has already achieved our first Victorian renewable energy target for renewable energy generation to be 25% of electricity generation in Victoria by 2020. In fact, Victoria's renewable energy generation share was 34.1% in the financial year of 2021 to 22. So we're well on our way to achieving our remaining VRET targets. The projects delivered under the first VRET auction have successfully brought forward more than 800 megawatts of new renewable electricity generation capacity. Earlier this month, we announced the results of the second VRET reverse auction. Through VRET 2, 6 new solar farms will be delivered, generating an additional 623 megawatts. That's enough clean energy to power more than 300,000 Victorian homes, more than every home in Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo and Shepparton combined. Critically, 4 of these projects will include up to 365 megawatts and 600 megawatt hours of battery storage. This is around the entire capacity of the existing operational batteries in Victoria, so we're effectively doubling the clean, dispatchable energy available for the grid. These 6 projects will generate $1.48 billion of economic investment in new renewable energy projects and support 920 jobs and opportunities for local businesses across Victoria. They will contribute to the achievement of 100% renewable electricity for all government operations by 2025, including schools, hospitals and our metro train network. We've delivered the largest household energy package of any state ever, with $797 million provided to replace old appliances, improve the energy efficiency of social housing, and to make sure that households can reap the benefits of electrification. We've announced major programs to take advantage of renewable hydrogen and deploy it in real-world applications like running buses, standalone power systems, and our communications networks. We're also working with the New South Wales Government to deliver Australia's first ever renewable hydrogen refuelling network along our busiest freight corridor, the Hume Highway between Melbourne and Sydney. And of course, we're making sure that every Victorian can benefit from the transition to renewable energy through our Solar Homes program, which has helped 200,000 households install solar. These are just some of the ways the Victorian Government is driving ambitious reforms to accelerate Victoria's transition to net zero. I'd encourage everyone here to join us in taking action on climate change and make use of tools such as Snapshot Climate. Congratulations to the team at Ironbark Sustainability on delivering this very important tool.
All right, thank you, Minister. I'm now going to pass on to Imogen, who's going to give us some of the pretty big updates. Imogen.
Hi, everybody. Really nice to have you all here, and I'm really excited to share some of this information with you today. On the screen, you can just see an example snapshot. I've just pulled up Bega Valley, and the new information there is the 2020 data. So this is a new year of information for the snapshot profile. And if you move to the next screen, Lex, you can also see that there's the 2020 and 21 financial year. So we provide snapshots in both calendar year and financial years, and that can be interesting for a variety of these reasons we'll talk about later. You can also see in the top right corner on the slide above, Lex, that there's a new little time bar in the time series in the corner, which allows you to jump from one year to another. So you can readily access information from 2018 to 2020, 21, depending on the calendar year or financial year that you're looking at. The next slide shows another really important new addition to Snapshot for the year. We've included a completely new emissions sector, the Industrial Processes and Product Use, or otherwise known as IPPU. This means that the snapshot profile is now complete. It has all of the emissions in your local area accounted for, and that makes it something called a Basic Plus profile, which is the global protocols terminology for this type of profile. So before, all of your emissions didn't include the IPPU sector, and now it does. The interesting thing we've also added, and this is thanks to the Victorian government, we've provided a time series so you can compare emissions year on year. You can do this for all sectors, and you can also jump to subsectors, which is another really big addition. If you hover over your snapshot profile, it will take you to the emissions subsector, and you can see all the emissions for, in this case, the electricity sector, broken down by residential, commercial, and industrial. But within the industrial subsector, there are a whole lot of new categories which you could not access before. So there's construction, there's mining, there's transport, and there's a whole range of manufacturing subsectors that you can see as well. Now, this information can be really useful because often it's 1 or 2 or 3 key industries within your local government area that will have a really large proportion of emissions. And councils have a really key role to play in facilitating relationships with those parties and working with them to reduce emissions, and subsequently taking a big chunk of the pie out of the puzzle. We also have a time series for each subsector. So you can see emissions, in this case, in the electricity sector. And I'll show you some analysis on this across states later, but broadly speaking, emissions are trending down in the stationary energy sector and are likely to rapidly increase the rate at which they are trending down due to some really strong policies across the board at both federal and state levels. The navigation bars are also a little bit different. So you can see at the top there's CY and FY, which is calendar year and financial year, so you can jump between the two. The total profile will take you back to your full circle ring, and then you also have the 2 other bars which show the time series and the subsector series. And we have subsector information for each sector. So we have transport emissions, which are broken down according to on-road, aviation, and in some sectors you also have rail and tram. So for example, the Gold Coast, just pulled up here, has emissions data from Google Environmental Insights Explorer, which basically takes phone data from people driving around in their cars and allocates it to your local emissions area. Whereas some municipalities, we don't have that data for. It's primarily based on population. So if you have a population of over 25,000 people, you are likely to have Google EIE data. And if you're smaller than that in population, you are unlikely to. We also have time series for transport data and all of the sectors. And this is where the calendar year, financial year can be a bit interesting because it looks like transport emissions are trending down quite significantly. But if you flip to calendar year, you can see that that is actually almost entirely due to COVID. So COVID kicked in pretty much at the start of 2020. And this is a discrepancy. It is likely to bounce back again once the behaviour changes that came along with COVID are no longer being enacted. We also have emissions for agricultural, and this is also broken down by different types. So dairy cattle, meat cattle, sheep and lambs, hay silage, and in some sectors you'll get different information around cropping and other proportions. Vegetables, for example, is a category that pops up for some sectors or some places. And the agricultural emissions are the most variable of the lot. They will bounce around according to variable factors like weather, floods, all sorts of things will make a difference to the agricultural sector. Just quickly, gas is also an interesting one. I've just added in for each of these sectors, you'll also get a table. So you can get the total numbers and compare them year on year. Gas emissions have remained relatively stable, but we know the price has increased really significantly. So that will, this is just one piece of the socioeconomic factors of surrounding climate and emissions data. So we may see that price kick in, make a change, whereas, people who are capable of switching off gas are more likely to due to that price hike. We also have waste and IPPU that you can see are quite small wedges for most councils and communities. And we've purposely displayed these proportionally so that you can get a sense of what they look like in terms of your total emissions profile. But some communities have quite large IPPU emissions profiles. For example, Wollongong and Gladstone, it makes up over half of their emissions profile, and that relates directly to a few companies within those LGAs. So BlueScope Steel in Wollongong and Orica and Alcoa, I think, in Gladstone. The top 10 councils with IPPU emissions are listed there. They range probably between sort of 10 to 50%, the top 10. Most councils will only have a small proportion of IPPU, about 5%, which primarily comes from refrigerants used in their community. We've also added a new button to the download section, the CSV button, so you can actually download your data files and play around with them yourselves. And we also, for those of you that don't know, some people don't know this, you can download the chart and the table for each emissions profile, but not only the total. We can't currently do that for the subsectors, it's only for the total profile. And you can also share your profile. There's a handy sharing button so that you can make it really accessible to your communities and use it for advocacy. That's the bulk of the changes. I'll just take you through a couple of interesting tidbits around trends and analysis. This is COVID in the transport sector. So these are all in the calendar year format. Inner West in Sydney, Maribyrnong in Victoria, in Melbourne, and Western Australia. So just sort of Western Australia hit a whole lot less hard. And you know, the inner city councils often hit harder in the eastern states. This also just shows the change in transport activity comparing 2019 to 2020 data. So a big drop in public transport, less of a drop in personal car use. Nationally, the electricity emissions have also dropped, and this compares just two states, New South Wales and Victoria. And in Victoria, there's a big drop in commercial electricity in that 2020 year. And again, that's probably primarily due to COVID. This is a comparison just on electricity data across the states. Interesting in that some states are changing quite dramatically and others are not. So Tasmania and South Australia, there's a really significant drop in emissions over the past 3 years. Victoria and New South Wales are starting to pick up on that trend, but it's not quite as obvious. And Western Australia, Queensland and Northern Territory are not there yet. So I guess another interesting thing about having this time series is that we're likely to see a really significant drop off in stationary energy emissions over the next couple of years, with them dropping, you know, 80, 90% over the decade, which is also interesting in terms of councils and their strategies and whether putting efforts in the stationary energy sector are going to duplicate the efforts at the state or federal government scale at this stage. Our data, the actual data behind Snapshot has been updated quite significantly. This is a poll from a couple of years ago where we asked you if we could source more accurate data, should we include it? And resoundingly, you said yes. So we have taken your advice and added it into the profiles. This means that your profile number will change. And we have included that change over the course of the past 3 years. So your 2018 or 2019 profile will also change. Just to give you a comparison. Actually, before we do that, here is, next one, next.
Sorry.
So this is actually the source of the data across the board for each sector. It's pretty technical and most of you probably don't really want to know this, but the key message is the bits highlighted in yellow, more accurate and more localized data. And we are working towards trying to make all of the data that we source tier 2, but that will take time and is dependent on the availability and the source of the data. But more and more we are getting to that tier 2 state, and we'll keep working on it as we go.
Just a question here, tier 2, what does that mean, high level, Imogen?
So for example, tier 2 would be that Google data, which we get from phone usage. So it's pretty specific to your local area and quite accurate. Tier 1 data would be taking state transport data and modelling it according to the population and other specific characteristics of your LGA. So it won't be quite as detailed information for your local area.
Awesome. And that's been a bit of a journey for those that have been here before. We the Google EIE data, for example, about 2-3 years when we were able to get that, we were able to put it on there for everyone. And I'll just make a point too. Firstly, another question came up about, will this be shared? We'll share these slides. We also have a 4 or 5 page doco that summarises all of these changes as well that you can receive afterwards. Imogen.
So this is just a comparison. This is 2019 information for Darebin, a council in Victoria, but it's the information we provided in 2020, which was updated in 2021 and is now being updated again in 2022. So the numbers have changed each year. And interestingly, even with the addition of IPPU, Darebin's total number has dropped. And this is because we've got better electricity information around that data source. All the methodology will be published online in the next week or two. And you can access this and share it and dig deep into any of the information that you like.
Awesome. Thank you, Imogen. Keep the questions coming. I can see them coming up there, and yep, we'll get to all we can. And as you know, having responded to this in advance, there were a lot of questions around data, and we do have that special data webinar coming up if we don't get to it today. People wanted to know a lot. So there's a lot of questions that come about, tell us about accuracy of data, tell us about accuracy of data, what are you going to do about this data? Or it might be things that, specific things that some people or groups are interested in. The other thing we often get asked a lot is around how Snapshot is used by other councils. You know, what are the learnings? In the past, we've spoken about examples of this, and you can check the old webinars for that. And we've got some resources as well that we'll show a little bit later around this. But we thought we might actually just get 3 or 4 councils on the line to just give a little 1-minute snippet of how they've been using it. Because when we sent this webinar registration invite out, we got some awesome responses from our friends out there in local government land. I'm actually going to start with Gemma Cook. If you could unmute yourself, Gemma, who's the Senior Environmental Project Officer for the City of Joondalup in WA. She's also worked at Walgar. She's been in Melbourne, I think, for a bit. And Gemma, we hear that the Snapshot tool has been put to pretty good use in WA. We were thrilled to hear your story. Tell us about the Millennium Kids team and Agents of Change.
Thanks, Lex. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, we worked with Millennium Kids to develop some climate change games for a sustainability festival stall. So I sent through the Snapshot tool to Kat at Millennium Kids, which is a not-for-profit group that works with lots of schools and youth to empower them around climate change. So they use the kids use the Snapshot tool to develop games that where they could see what the biggest sources of emissions are for the City of Joondalup's community emissions, and the games were targeted around actions and behaviours that people could change around those main emission sources. They hadn't come across the tool before, and one of the projects that Millennium Kids used the Snapshot tool information for was to translate the climate change information into multiple languages to make it more accessible and build knowledge in multicultural communities. So you can see the picture there. Siddharth, who is in the City of Canning, has come up with 10 actions, and yeah, he's used the Snapshot tool to look at what the main sources are there.
Awesome. Thanks, Gemma. And there's even a TV show these guys were doing. I think, I don't know, maybe follow Gemma Cook on Instagram or whatever LinkedIn's there are these days. And if you can, again, post, or maybe Ironbark can post some of that extra information, but it was so cool. I might actually now pass to Vicky, if Vicky's on the line too, Vicky Perrott, who's the president of Geelong Sustainability, who have done a pretty amazing job building community resilience and advocating for the environment and supporting effective action on climate change. Vicky, what can you share with other councils and community groups around how you use this tool in the advocacy that you guys have done down in Sleepy Hollow?
Take away the Sleepy Hollow, thank you very much. In a number of ways, it's been very powerful. And I'm delighted to see that there will be a time series coming made more easier going forward, because clearly in our region, our emissions have stayed around this 3 million tonnes. So that's one thing we've been able to say to council, come on, what are you doing? You've got, they've signed up to the state government targets, but in fact, it's not happening on the ground. So we've been advocating very strongly. We've also drilled down into the data, and we could see that in Geelong that the emissions when it comes to gas were largely coming from residential and commercial, and we knew that that was coming from heating. So one of our big campaigns down here has been trying to get Geelong Renewables Not Gas going as a campaign, because we're strongly advocating against the Viva floating gas terminal that wants to set up in Crier Bay 300 metres from homes. So we've been able to also, for our own group, we've been running a number of bulk buys and things like that, because tapping into that residential emissions around electricity has been something that's been very powerful for us to be able to look at and work with. So that's a few of the ways that we've been using it in our advocacy and also our activities.
Awesome. Thank you, Vicky. I won't say Sleeping Hollow. I'll say the premiers of the Football League and all the amazing things from Geelong. And Katie, who I think has dropped off her kids and is here, sorry for the early start for the Western Australians. Katie Biggs from the Shire of Augustus-Margaret River is the Sustainability Planning Officer. They released their climate action plan last year, which was, I think, a fascinating model where it was very much run in consultation with the community, or even community-led, recognising that zero emissions targets are accepted norm across international Australian jurisdictions, and in a very short space of time become legislative requirements. You had an interesting comment or two to us, Katie, about how you were surprised at some of the breakdowns in your profile. What did you guys find that, I guess, surprised you, and how was that used?
Yeah, I guess what was really interesting for us was to see what a big proportion the transport was, because I guess we'd had this really big focus on sort of electricity and waste, and then we've just started to move into agriculture. But then when we look at a breakdown of our emissions here, like at the time when we looked at it, it was nearly 60%, and it's still around that half of our emissions. And so it's really highlighted for us that that's an area that we're going to have to put a lot more focus into, and it's probably an area that we had very little focus on in the past. So I think it's really helped us to shift and move towards where we need to go with our policies, and it's very much a work in progress for us. I think we've only just really begun on that journey, but at least now we know how important it is.
That's awesome. Thanks, Katie. I think that's one thing that we heard a lot when we first released Snapshot, was a lot of councils and community groups who, were thinking, oh, hang on a minute, we're spending a lot of time on waste. We didn't realise it was only 2 or 3%. So the focus on the area which has the highest source of emissions. And I think a lot of people had brought up the ability to potentially look at forecasting and looking at future emissions, which I think will become a lot more powerful, because that also means potentially there'll be certain council areas where there's less focus on electricity or stationary energy, because, as mentioned at the start, as mentioned by the Minister, while it's still an area to focus on, this is going to look very different in 2030, 2035. And for a lot of profiles, transport's going to be a big part of it. And so that might help in the communication and more importantly, where you're actually putting resources into the most efficient areas. I know Bob might be here, but I'm sorry, I'm sharing something from Bob from the Community Voices for Hume, because when we saw this about a year ago, it was just so awesome. We know that There are councils in some New South Wales, like Ballina, have used Snapshot for about 4 years in their reporting and their planning, and in their IPNR reporting, which is a requirement for New South Wales councils and to raise awareness. And we've had a lot that have used it for just chucking it in a strategy or using it for target setting. But if you check out that website, it was amazing what we saw last year with the crew up in Wingecarribee and the Beyond Zero Future for Southeast New South Wales. I think it was originally Community Voices for Hume, which is our good friend Angus Taylor's seat up in New South Wales, who were using Snapshot and even developing some of their own data. So a really interesting thing to look at there. In regards to advocacy, just a reminder that we do actually have these federal electorate snapshots. I'm going to pull up a couple of fun little seats from the last election, and also state-based information that can be used. And then before we get on to questions and over to you guys, just a couple of final points. The first one is, again, a few related events and resources. And the first one is that we do have this webinar coming up in a couple of weeks. We'll chuck the registration in the drop form in this now. Thank you, Charlotte. And it will also be in a bunch of links that we'll send through post-webinar once you give us feedback. But this is where you can come along and get into all the detail about biochar or cruise ships or what's happening with waste emissions in 2037 and a half. We'll have the guys on hand that can really jump into that detailed information. So sign up and jump in there so we can provide as much as we can. Just another point, advocacy came up quite a little bit and continues to come up, and we know that it's used at a local level, Snapshot is, but there is a bit of a campaign on behalf of ICLEI, Oceania, Cities Power Partnership, Climate Emergency Australia, the Global Covenant of Mayors, all the kind of big climate programs and networks in Australia and even globally, Better Futures Australia and the Climate Works Centre and Melbourne City for Centre for Cities, all in all representing about 204 councils and I think 80% of the population, with 3 key asks to the feds. Councillor William Chan from Sydney at this link here gives you a 2-minute overview, and it's just worth keeping in mind if you're thinking about advocacy to the feds on behalf of local governments, we really need to make sure that we've got a consistent message. If you are after examples of, I guess, how this is being used, how Snapshot is used, and how councils are setting targets or implementing projects and programs, please remember that the Local Government Review has 99 pages worth of this information, surveying 270 odd councils. And so that's a really good place to start. And another one is for those that are working in the hot seat, understanding what the hell CPP, BFA, R2, CC, EAC, 40, ZCC, RAD, CAD, CANA, and all these things are, is a 5 or 6 pager that just sort of tries to cheat your way through some of those horrific acronyms that we have in local government land. So they might be helpful. And the final one is just to, if you haven't seen this yet, but BZE have launched their Deploy research. I think it might have been a week or 2 ago, but Beyond Zero Emissions, as people will well know, an extraordinary organisation that have been half of Snapshot for the last 4 or 5 years, and it wouldn't have happened without the merging of the 2 organisations, trying to make sure that we're providing the best information and data for everyone. Their recent report demonstrates that 81% emissions reduction by 2030 is completely achievable, looking at clean tech over the next couple of years, supported by targeted carbon drawdown. That research is interesting. They've got a couple of webinars, I think, and launches coming up or already done. Make sure you check that out as well. Okay, 15, 16 minutes for questions. I think we've done really well here. I think, as I mentioned at the start, and some of us here that were looking at all of the questions that came through, and that you can have a look at all the questions as well after this webinar if you want. The summary is that there's a lot around good approaches to how to use it, and we've sort of touched on a few here, and the other one is the accuracy around the data, how it's generated, can we trust it, will it continue? Some of the main themes. And so keep the questions coming, but we'll try and sort of merge a couple into one just to start things off. And one of the questions that comes up and we hear a lot is, what's happening with the long-term plan to maintain Snapshot? Are we going to maintain it? Are we actually going to keep it? We are going to keep it, and there's nothing to worry about there. It's safe for many years, but do keep an eye out for calls to help. Sponsorship is really helpful, but even just spreading the word, letters of support when it's required to try and advocate, I guess, to other levels of government is really helpful, and it all helps those who have been around and understand the experience of how these tools come and go. We don't want that to happen here, and that doesn't look like it's going to happen, but I think we're in a good spot. I might actually pass to Paul Brown, who is in a room somewhere here. Paul, you get asked this a lot. What's happening? What's the long-term plan for Snapshot?
We plan to keep providing it long-term. It does cost a fair bit and takes a lot of time to prepare this information, but I guess at Ironbark we have an ethic, I guess, of understanding that a lot of people can't afford this data, and that data, particularly around emissions and its trajectory, what's changing over time, is a real barrier to action. So I guess an additional shout out to the sponsors who are essentially helping to fund the ongoing nature of Snapshot. But we're essentially very keen to keep funding this. We have no plans to change that. We'll continue to add functionality. It is something that we see the use of and are committed long-term to. And over time, data will get better and better as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. I understand Gina Reinhardt's got $15 million to throw as well, so we might go on. No, don't worry, I'm not going to ask her. Another one we get a lot around is data quality and accuracy. We get this question every webinar, every month, every week, every day. And as mentioned, when it comes to transport, we've managed to start the relationship with Google and Environmental Insights Explorer and improve transport emissions and the accuracy of that. So it actually is real data. With electricity and stationary energy in Australia, often working with distribution businesses and utilities can be a little bit more challenging than working with a behemoth like Google, which shouldn't be the case because the data is there. And the challenge we have is that we can use that tier 1 data that Imogen talked about before, which is state-based, and then we scale it down to the municipality. But ideally, we'd want to actually get that tier 2 real data. And we have got improvements with this with this update with Snapshot, especially in a couple of key states. But I know that in Victoria, we've had a couple of challenges to try and get that data from the distribution businesses. It's been going for about 22 years, this challenge. But I might actually throw to Scott McHenry from the Eastern Alliance for Greenhouse Action to just let us know, what's the process there, Scott? Where are we up to? Are we able to get any data from the distribution businesses?
Yeah, thanks, Lex, and well done on the Snapshot update. It's really fantastic and another great webinar. So awesome to have the Minister's address and the ministerial commitment to improve data accuracy. And yeah, we really need the DNSPs to come to the table to support us all. And the state government, I guess, are uniquely placed to help us make that happen. So, hearing that 22 years of frustration, back in July, the alliances teamed up and wrote a joint letter to the Deputy Secretary of DELP, sort of calling for some assistance to make, DNSP public data publicly available at the postcode level, segmented by, market category, daily, monthly, yearly intervals, etc., as they are doing in other states. So really just bring Victoria in line with other states, freely available on some sort of portal, could be by a Snapshot. And try and get away from this sort of user pay model that we've currently got with C4Net that's probably, acting as a barrier to councils more than anything. So, we've had positive discussions with the state thus far. They've committed to go away and, engage with the DNSPs to try and make something happen. It's still with them at the moment, but you know, they're firing over questions. So something's happening, but we all know it's very slow going working with DNSPs. So fingers crossed, we'll have some good news soon.
Thank you very much, Scott. Yes, fingers crossed, keep putting the pressure on and hopefully we'll get there. Okay, jump in for questions. Agreed, Vicky. We need data. I'm just looking at it here. There was a question earlier about councils, the ability to compare, which is a bit of a challenge, and I might pass to any of you guys if you want to answer it, but we have in the past had the ability to have compare council cohorts. And so you can look at a council that is similar to yourself. And Matt Sullivan, who's been furiously typing away here, please jump in if you want to add a quick response as well. But one of the challenges is that if you compare and don't understand what you're comparing with, you can get led down a path that's not necessarily going to be the most efficient or effective path of action planning for yourself.
Yeah, I'll just add on, Lex, to that. That's totally the case. We definitely understand the desire and the need and the benefit from doing those sort of comparisons. A guiding light for Snapshot has been the creation of tools, a platform that is accessible and usable by people without having to be mediated by experts or consultants. Comparisons can present some challenges to doing that because, like, some comparisons might be misleading or like, but we're really, really interested in building on that functionality. So, like, I think that's going to be sort of, now that we've sort of raised the standard and increased the visualization and handle some of these time series stuff, it's going to be an area that we're really going to be interested in working with and creating like nice user experiences that help guide users and councils and community to be able to do that effectively.
Thanks, Matt. While you're on, I'm going to keep you there for another question that's come up, because we do get this a lot as well, just around the how timely we can get the data updates. And so people have asked, when can we get the ABS information or the Energy Australia updates? So is there, when, for example, would we be able to get any updated information from ABS? And just, of course, bearing in mind there are some potential consequences with that too if we go back and update everything, right?
Sure. So it's always just a struggle to try and make the data as contemporary as possible, but also make it so that it's comprehensive and that you don't have to sort of go back and alter previously released figures. It's just a challenging environment in that respect, but what we're consistently trying to do is work with data providers to get earlier and earlier access to some of this information. So, for instance, securing more agreements with DNSPs and more streamlined pipelines of DNSP data will help make that more possible. And then there's also, this extends into a conversation which I won't go into now, but it's all about tracking and evaluation. And so those conversations center and make most sense to focus in around specific areas of interest, like, say, electricity in the residential sector, for instance, or transport breakdowns or take up of EVs. In those instances, there's the sort of the need and the value of that information changes. You'd like it more frequently, you'd like it at shorter time spans and like. And so we're trying to push in that direction of saying, like, how can we get that kind of information available and extend beyond like this sort of annual style reporting? So there's a few different things we're trying out here. But yeah, we are at the moment a little bit constrained by some of the release dates of some of the larger data sets from the federal government and the like.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And Matt will be here again at that Data Nerd webinar, not restrained, completely unleashed, to talk about all this sort of stuff. We rely on Matt probably more than any other organisation would on someone in the world. He was involved in Snapshot from the start and developing the GPC protocol way too much. So bring any of these questions as well in a couple of weeks if you'd like. There's a question here from Rachel at Frankston. Tips for local councils on how they should communicate changes to previously reported emissions data, noting that it has now been updated. Imogen?
Good question, Rachel. It is a bit of a tricky thing to communicate because people get one number and then they don't understand why it's changed. We have actually provided quite a comprehensive resource on this in the user guide part of Snapshot. If you go to the top tab, there's a user guide drop-down section, and we have an explanation. You can just take and share with your communities. And if you still have questions on that, then please get in touch with us and we'll do our best to answer them.
We had our Snapshot sponsors and some other councils come to some testing a couple of weeks ago. So we try and figure out, what do we include with the changes? Is it going to be something that's going to put people off? So we really value this sort of feedback and input because we're guided by it. As you saw from the previous webinar, and down the track, if Scott McHenry from Ego is Wheezy's magic and tomorrow we've got just complete data from distribution businesses and we can put it in here, it means that everything changes again. But we totally appreciate that that's a challenge. There's a question here about working with the grassroots and working with your community. I might pass again to you first, Imogen, if you like, and then if Gemma or Katie want to jump in with that as well, please do.
I've always found this a really critical part. Council emissions are a really small part of the total for every community, usually about 1 to 2%. If they're not looking at the community-wide emissions, then no one's doing their job properly. And community is a massive asset for councils and communities to work together. Vicky has done a marvellous job in Geelong with the Geelong Sustainability Group and advocating at that level. If you're a council worker, I would advocate really strongly for you to build strong relationships with your community. And if you're a community member, I would advocate strongly for you to build strong relationships with your council and work together on this problem because neither of you can tackle it alone.
Matt, if you're there, Manny's got an awesome question, and this might be able to reflect on some of the work in the last year or so with the likes of, I think, Shep, Ganawara, Ben, Ballarat, even a couple of regional councils. Further info in innovations around measuring ag emissions data. So Manny, who you know from Hepburn, makes up 40% of emissions in their community. It's tougher to reduce and measure. So many innovations spreading around regenerative farming models, local carbon sequestrations, kelp cows. It's an exciting area. What are the innovations in that area?
Sure, yes. So it is a really, really important area of innovations. I would say that having been looking into that increasingly often with the work we're doing across the more regional areas of Australia, what I think is the case is that we do see a degree of persistence in agricultural emissions, and where we are seeing variation occur, it's through changes in the type of agricultural commodities and like that are being used. That being said, yes, it's very, very ripe in innovations. What I'm kind of seeing is that it's a sector that there's other areas that have had this, and this is very persistent. It's called the valley of death. It's where there's you have all these incubators, these really, really interesting ideas being produced. And then there's also, you've got solutions that work extremely well at scale that are very, very well understood, very scaled deployment models. But the valley of death is the place that links those two. And it's where the transfer from the really, really innovative space is converted over time into something that works commercially. And I think that that is going to be one of the key areas of focus in the agricultural sector for the next 5-10 years. And so also really interested in getting better ways of collecting information and more localized information about how those things are being applied.
Awesome. Matt, there's a question about land use, unless Imogen, you wanted to touch on that first, that I know is going to excite. But whoever answers it has to be very quick.
Well, just both on the land use point and also on the transport being offset through other, power purchase agreements or whatever. Snapshot only looks at emissions. It doesn't look at the solutions, but we are also building data sets that can show the positive actions that are happening in each LGA so that you can track those solutions pathways as well.
And Matt, did you want to give a 30-second summary on anything exciting in the land use area?
Sure. So the thing about land use is that we have been applying the sort of attributions that are linked to the federal government, but there are some really interesting ways in which land use data is being collected through satellite imagery and automatic emissions allocations. So we're currently developing a solution that will do that, which will be based off satellite imaged process data that does land use allocation methods. We're working right now on researching and applying that. That has been existing in the past. There are some solutions around that, but the accuracy of that has classically been quite low. But again, through some new data sources, there's some improvements to that process. So that is something we're looking to make a movement on in the coming months.
Awesome. Thanks heaps, Matt. And again, if you want to know more about that, or if you want to delve into detail, come along to our webinar on data in a couple of weeks' time. First things first, though, please jump in here and you can download this slide deck. And the point before that Imogen made as well around Snapshot doesn't have the information on the solutions. We asked in advance about the, where we want to go to next, what do you want to see? And you can have a look there at the data and see what the focus is and what the preferences are and the priorities for councils. And so that is all in a doco that you will get once you jump on and just let us know what we want to look at next with some feedback. And also on that survey there that's in the Charlotte's put in the chat, thank you very much, Charlotte, is a document that tells you about the different tiers, the different type of data from all sources, from all states. And so a little bit more information on, the approaches that we take for each of the sectors and subsectors. So jump online and you can get all of that in your hot little hands immediately. And this slide deck. We're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much to everybody. Really appreciate it. Thanks to Paul, Imogen, Matt, Charlotte, Rich, Jenny, whoever else is on the line, and to the crew at DELP for putting the funding towards these updates. It's much appreciated, as you can see from a lot of the comments here. And you can see it's a very small little outlay for improvements that get to benefit every single council and community, all 537 of them in Australia. So it's much appreciated. We'll catch you at the next one in a couple of weeks' time. But that is all for now. Catch you next time.